Christian nationalism. Even most believers find this problematic. Many disagree with the theocracy called for, forcing Christianity on unbelievers, despite actually wanting laws that would do just that, like banning abortion and same sex marriage. Nevertheless, Braxton Hunter, host of Trinity Radio, and Jonathan Pritchett, co host, allowed Tim Stratton to defend this position that even they don't agree with. Tim Stratton is a youth pastor who saw firsthand how the lies of new atheists were impacting young, impressionable minds of his students. So he started a ministry called Free Thinking Ministries, which tells young people what to think so that they can be free thinkers, thinking what they are told to think. Jonathan Pritchett is on the faculty of Trinity Theological Seminary along with Braxton Hunter and is a frequent co-host of the show. The seminary is an online degree program. Will Tim Stratton make a case for Christian nationalism being a good thing? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. I have a new patron to announce. Patty R. has joined the family. Welcome, Patty R. I was really surprised that anyone is defending Christian nationalism, but I guess there are some people saying the quiet part out loud. This video is an hour and 20 minutes long, so I'll just address a few points. If you want to see the whole video, a link is in the description.
I have Tim with us. Tim is representing a form of Christian. We know that Christian nationalism is not monolithic. Get it? We hear all that. But Tim is going to talk to us about how he sees Christian nationalism.
But first and foremost, let me be clear. I'm a citizen of the kingdom of God. I'm a citizen of heaven. I'm primarily a nationalist when it comes to the kingdom of heaven. But I'm temporarily trying to make this world a better place while encouraging mass immigration from this world into the borders of heaven. That's what we call evangelism, right? Let's define our terms. First, let's talk about what it means to be a Christian. Got all sorts of people calling themselves Christians, but I contend that if one claims to be a Christian, then they will strive to follow the teachings, commands, and example that Jesus Christ provided. So simply put, I love Jesus and I try to live according to his teachings. So I think that's, John 8:31 and 14:21 through 24. So yeah, I love Jesus and try to live according to his teachings and his commands. So this is what makes me a conservative Christian.
Does it? Mormons, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and liberal Christians would all say the same thing, that they love Jesus and follow his teachings. You would likely disagree, but it's a disagreement over what did Jesus teach. If your definition of Christian is broad enough to include anyone who self-identifies as believing in Jesus and following his teaching, that would include many that are not conservative Christians. If by follow Jesus' teachings you mean your interpretation of what Jesus taught, then you can narrow the field of who you accept as a Christian. But now, instead of Christian being anyone that follows what Jesus taught, it's anyone who follows what you believe Jesus taught. If this is the real definition of what is a Christian, you need to demonstrate that your interpretation of the Bible is the right one, and how far one can stray from your view and can still be said to be following Jesus' teachings. Your definition of Christian has done nothing for us. I seriously doubt that you mean what you said, particularly because it would include liberal Christians, whom you specifically excluded with your final claim. The fact that you think you have defined Christian in a meaningful way goes to show just how narrow-minded you are when it comes to your beliefs, that you don't even see that millions of people share some, but not all, of your beliefs.
I am a conservative Christian, and this means that I strive to conserve the law of Christ and everything that Jesus said, taught, and exemplified. And this is also why I oppose quote unquote progressive Christianity, right? We ought to conserve the law of Christ and not make progress toward anything else.
Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged.
We should not make progress toward anything else? Really? So the Amish have it right? Freeze the world at 1850 and no progress allowed? I realize that's not what he means, especially since he's not Amish. But I seriously doubt he begins to understand what he is saying. He wants to conserve the original teachings of Jesus? What is that? What did Jesus teach? No one knows. I'm not even sure Jesus was a real person anymore. Much of what the Christian church believes today came from early second century thought. Paul was the first to begin to shape Christian doctrine, and the Gospels weren't even written when he did so. There were no teachings of Jesus known to him other than through the visions that he had. Yes, he did meet Peter and some of the other disciples, but he says he didn't get his theology from them. The Jesus Paul taught about was not likely a physical person, but rather a mythical being that appeared to Paul and revealed mysteries about the celestial realm. There were many mystery cults in Paul's day, and Christianity likely started as another mystery cult. Nowhere does Paul mention Mary, Joseph, a physical birth, a physical death, or any other reason to think that Jesus was a literal person. The closest you come is Jesus dying for the sins of the world. But there were many dying and rising gods in that day. Some, like Julius Caesar, were real persons, but not all. Romulus is supposed to have died and risen again, but nobody thought that Romulus was a physical person. Dr. Richard Carrier, in Jesus from Outer Space, says there's a dark period from about 50 AD to about 90 or 110 AD in which no writings about Christianity survive. During this period, the Gospels were written. This is 2 entire generations of silence. Following this silence, we get Gospels with a story about a physical Jesus who lived and walked the earth, and church fathers writing about this Jesus, following the writing of the Gospels. It is likely the original writings about Christianity didn't survive, as they were destroyed by those that favored what has now become the Orthodox viewpoint. People, like Tim here, claim to follow the original teachings of Jesus, but fail to realize that we have no idea what, if anything, that even was. If you haven't read Jesus from Outer Space, I highly recommend it. It gave me a new perspective on the purpose of the Gospel of Mark, as well as historical insight into first century Christian thought, or rather, the lack of evidence of it.
An American nationalist, depending upon how one defines that term, who strongly identifies with their own nation and vigorously supports its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations.
And do you think that's a good thing? Seeking to promote your own interests to the detriment of others? Doesn't your own Bible say otherwise?
As a Christian, I believe our nation's theological and philosophical foundations are pretty close to perfect.
Our nation's theological foundations are non existent. This country was not founded as a Christian nation. If that is news to you, you really need to learn a little American history before you address this topic. For example, the Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated under George Washington, signed by John Adams, with the unanimous consent of the Senate in 1797, and stated the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
And thus, any other nation who opposes America's foundational interests ought to be opposed by America.
So you not only have a false idea of what your own country is and how it was founded, you use that falsehood to justify forcing your religious views on other nations that don't hold to your views. Could you possibly sink any lower?
To their exclusion or detriment. So, to clarify, I believe America, although far from perfect, or I said we're pretty close to perfect. We are not perfect. We've made many mistakes, but I do contend that America is the greatest nation to ever exist on the face of the planet. In fact, I think the entire world should adopt the theological and philosophical foundations of our great nation.
We are the only industrialized nation on the planet that has no national health care. We lead the world in declining life expectancy because of it. We have racial inequality, economic disparity, and we are currently so polarized that it's hard for us to get anything accomplished. Sexual abuse and scandal is rampant in the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist churches, and almost every other major denomination. That is what you call close to perfect? Tim calls himself an American, but I question if he even lives on planet Earth. He seems to live in a fantasy world where America does no wrong, or almost no wrong. But then again, just believing in Christianity requires you to block out any information that evidences your beliefs to be wrong.
Not long ago, it became clear to me that not all Christians feel the same way that I do.
You don't say.
That's a start. Think you could maybe expand on that thought and realize that not all people agree with your religious view? Nor do they want to, as there is no reason to think that they are true.
Christian nationalism was kind of a pejorative until the certain people adopted it kind of as a badge of honor, because they say, well, we are Christian and we are nationalists. And by nationalists, they were saying, that we should, the nation should look out for its own interests. But the Christian nationalist movements, the loudest voices in that, they affirm things that Christianity should be privileged in the United States by the government over against other faiths.
Exactly, Jonathan. The prime focus of the Christian nationalist movement is to overthrow the Constitution and implement a theocracy. If one thinks this country is nearly perfect, why would one want to overthrow the Constitution in favor of a new form of government that is theocratic? The Christian nationalist is not a conservative. They don't want to preserve the status quo. They are radicals that want to do away with our government in favor of one that promotes their minority viewpoint.
They also believe that there should be some sort of Christian magistrate. Sometimes they refer to it as a Christian prince, or someone who it's not an ecclesiastical authority, but it is a political agent who can discern theological matters from the state, and can call synods, can answer theological disputes and settle those, can punish heretics, enforce blasphemy laws, things like this. And so all of that is ideas that they promote. Are you in agreement with like the Stephen Wolfe sort or the Joel Webbin sort of Christian nationalism?
Yep, they want not only Christianity, but they want to dictate what form of Christianity one must hold to. It's scary stuff.
So you brought up 2 points there. I don't think we need a prince, prince of theology, unless that's me. I guess I would really like that position.
He jests, but is there truth under the jest? I suspect Tim does want to dictate people's religious beliefs to them.
I don't know of any Christian that is qualified for that position.
Right.
Exactly. How would one decide which religion gets to have the prince? Would the country be divided by region? Would people need to move based on their religious beliefs? What would happen to people who aren't Christian?
Jonathan mentioned something about should Christians be privileged? And yes, a Christian nationalist, because I'm a Christian and a nationalist, Christianity is one of the positions that ought to be privileged because it can make logical sense of our theological and philosophical foundations.
That should be enough right there to dismiss Tim as having anything of value to say. He's so convinced that his way of thinking, his viewpoint, is the only right way to think. There's only one right viewpoint, that he's willing to sacrifice our founding principles of liberty and justice for all. And I realize our country has fallen far short of this goal. But Tim doesn't even want it as a goal. He wants one position, his, to have a position of honor, and anyone who disagrees, I don't know. But there certainly is no room for equality in his viewpoint.
And make no mistake, America has a theological and philosophical foundation in the Declaration.
No, it really doesn't. There is no mention of any God anywhere in the Constitution. The closest you come is a reference to a creator in the Declaration of Independence, as well as a mention of nature's God, whatever that is. And it makes no mention of who or what this creator or nature's God is. There's also an appeal to the supreme judge of the world to rectify the king's wrongs, whatever that might be. There's no clear theological position from the Declaration.
So the fact of the matter is that America's theological foundation is objectively true, no matter if they were consistent with that or not. And I've made no claims that they were consistent.
Well,
Um,
everyone agrees
I-
with that, but I
okay,
think
well then that's what I'm basing it
everyone
on.
should agree with
It-
The U.S. had a theological foundation, but the founding fathers just didn't live according to their own principles. That is patently false. The U.S. never had a theological foundation. The religious views of the founding fathers varied, with several being deists that didn't believe in any particular God, just that there was some form of a God. Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Church said the First Amendment was intended to raise a wall of separation between the church and state. The Supreme Court drew on that letter as the intent behind the First Amendment and enshrined the phrase into law in 1947 in Emerson versus Board of Education, a case involving government reimbursement to parents for the cost of busing their kids to school. Reimbursement was available to any school, public or private, with the net effect being money supporting Catholic schools disproportionately. The court found no violation, as the money was available to anyone of any faith, and thus the court found the Catholic faith was not favored by the government, even though the net effect was to funnel tax money to Catholic school families. As much as the Christian nationalists claim the phrase wall of separation between church and state isn't in our Constitution, it is de facto, as the Supreme Court put it there through the interpretation of the Constitution. To remove it, the court would have to overturn Everson.
is our theological foundation, which is what has been used as the foundation of our Constitution and for the human rights movement.
Bullshit. Not only is there no theological foundation for our Constitution, again, there is no mention of any God or theology in it, and it is directly opposed to 5 of the Christian 10 Commandments. It's neutral on a 6th. The neutral one is honoring one's father and mother. It opposes the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th as it prohibits the government from favoring any one God. It opposes the 10th in that capitalism promotes covetousness, depends on it for its survival, and the economy at our foundation was a capitalist economy. So not only does the U.S. not have any founding theology, the thought behind the founding of our country, the Constitution, was directly opposed to the most basic Christian belief, that one God is to be revered above all others. Yet you claim you want a position of privilege. How does this fit with the idea that all are created equal? Are Christians just more equal than unbelievers?
God. So I don't think this is a stretch to say, look, we have objectively true theological and philosophical foundations.
I'd like to see him back that claim. There is nothing objectively true about Christianity, other than it exists.
And even the same people that wrote them had trouble living consistently with them. The fact of the matter is, it's that foundation which has allowed us to fix evils in our nation and allows us to continue to fight for what's objectively true and right.
Really? So we fixed the problems of racism in this country? We fixed poverty, unwanted pregnancies, crime? All of these no longer exist because they were fixed by your theological foundations? Huh. So why are we still seeing so many problems in our country again?
Yeah, in what way should the nation privilege? Through law? Through legislation?
Well, that's another question, but we definitely shouldn't be.
Well, Christian nationalists have an answer to that question. Yes, through law and legislation and policy. So
yeah, so definitely legally, we should not be infringed legally through. So the First Amendment ought to apply across the board to Christianity.
I have to wonder if Tim didn't understand the question or if he's intentionally ducking it, as he knows legislating Christianity into law isn't a good idea, the very idea that he came here to defend. But his conclusion, the First Amendment ought to apply to Christianity, is already true. It absolutely does. The government can't tell the church what Christians can or can't believe, and the church can't expect financial or other favors from the government. Exactly the opposite of Tim's claim of privilege. So which is it, Tim? Pick a lane. Should the First Amendment apply to Christianity, or should Christianity be a privileged position?
The religion practiced by Hamas ought to be rejected. We ought not let anybody who believes as Hamas does into our country.
Tim wants a religious test for entry into the United States. What about unbelievers who are already citizens? I hope he plans to address that.
When the evil that's just occurred made Nazis look nice, I think that's worth doing something about. If we are to really love our neighbors, reports now of a family sitting around the breakfast table. They gouged out the eyes of the dad, chopped the fingers off of the kids and the legs off of the kids, took the baby and put it in the oven, turned it on, and then while the baby was being baked alive, raped the mom repeatedly in front of her family. Nazis wouldn't do something like that, and if they did, they would sure hide it. And Hamas brags about it. This is such an extreme evil that it seems to me to be a properly basic belief that if there's anything good about our nation or any other nation, they should go and, for the sake of love, destroy that evil.
Okay,
that's my take on it.
Similar types of evil have happened in African nations. I'm sure
Then I say,
remember
for the sake of loving our neighbor, we ought to do something about it.
Begin with, many of the claims of atrocities committed by Hamas have been retracted for lack of evidence. I'm not saying Hamas has committed no atrocities, but I am saying that some reports of atrocities have been exaggerated or fabricated and repeated without evidence. Tim would appoint himself and the U.S. as the global police in charge of toppling any government that he finds unacceptable. Like many in Africa, is this even feasible? It did not work out well in Afghanistan, Iran, Brazil, Haiti, or Chile. The position also contradicts your position that the U.S. should put its own interests over those of all others, even to the detriment of others. Which one is it, Tim? The U.S. is the arbiter of what governments are allowed to stand, or the U.S. should stick to upholding its own affairs? You seem to want to have your cake and eat it too.
In what way is interventionist a nationalist position?
Thank you. Jonathan has caught this inconsistency too.
Most people who are identifying as nationalists would say we don't get involved in any of that. We're not interventionists trying to do the world police thing. And you're saying that we have a moral obligation to go stomp out that evil. We just happen to be very selective about it when it doesn't.
Well,
Christian nationalism is not monolithic.
When it doesn't suit the United States interests, like in Darfur, we're going to stay out of it.
Okay, but Christian nationalism is not monolithic, and he said, "I'm telling you what I think about all this."
Yeah. But I'm asking, how is interventionism fit under the banner of nationalism?
If you're a Christian, I define Christian, and I define nationalism, and so if you're a Christian who is also a nationalist, and you're living consistently with both those terms, then if you're a Christian, that means you love your neighbor as yourself. And if you're in a position to do something about it, then you seek to love your neighbor as yourself.
Which isn't, as Jonathan pointed out, a nationalist position. It seems there is a conflict between your Christian view and your nationalism view. Which one is more important to you? Worse, going and toppling other governments can lead to disastrous results. I would not call what we did in Iran loving your neighbors as yourselves. Too often the U.S. goes off half-cocked on poor information or false information and topples a government, leaving the people of the country worse off than they were under the dictator that we toppled. Tim seems to have a naive view of U.S. foreign policy and the ability of the U.S. to do good for other countries, where in fact we often make things worse by not fully understanding the problems that we are trying to address. Is it any wonder, coming from a person who thinks he can have a ministry teaching young people what to think and calling it a free-thinking ministry? Tim seems to be unable to see his own self-contradiction.
Caleb Jackson says, should emphasis on libertarian free will imply that we should not use force or laws to enforce Christian values on other people via the government? Now, Tim, not steal your thunder, but I don't know, Caleb, how that would remove libertarian free will. You would still have libertarian free will even if you were in solitary confinement. You would just have fewer options available to you. But Tim, what is your answer?
So I'm not advocating Christianity and only Christianity. I'm advocating the theological foundations of America. And so recognizing that what we should look, if we're Americans, then that means that we're based on the foundation, on a theological and philosophical foundation, that all people have objective and unalienable rights that ought not be violated by anybody, including governments. That is what we should force or enforce. Those are the values that we ought to enforce on American culture. To do anything else is literally un-American.
Which is not a Christian idea. Christianity is not even a part of that idea. If all people have inalienable rights to freedom of religion, that directly contradicts your position that Christianity should be given a position of privilege. Pick a lane. Are you going to force your Christian values on all Americans, or are you going to let everyone have the right to choose their own values? You seem to imply that anyone who disagrees with your values isn't a real American. Is your plan to strip citizenship from any that disagree? If so, that would be enforcing Christianity on all by law, which you claim you don't intend to do. Just what is your plan to make everyone agree with you?
Christian values happen to align with that, right? So Christianity would be one of the worldviews that's privileged here, but it's not a so it gets confusing because we use the term Christian nationalism. It's really two things. I am a Christian who believes that our nation has the best theological foundations. So because I'm a Christian and because I'm a nationalist, maybe the best term isn't Christian nationalism. It's just a Christian who's also a nationalist. I think our nation's philosophical and theological foundations are objectively true, and they ought to be enforced here. And since we're Christians, we care about all people in the world, and therefore we should encourage the rulers of other nations to treat their citizens and to recognize these objective and unalienable rights that they possess as well.
Tim continues to miss the problem. Not all agree with his view. He wants to force his views on all who disagree, but not by force of law. Okay, then how? By what mechanism do you plan to change the minds of all who disagree with you? Mind control? Are you going to obtain some kind of mind control device?
We should use our influence as much as possible to see this kind of flourishing throughout the world. Now, as Paul says, as far as it's up to you, seek to live at peace with all people. It might not be possible for us to ensure that this happens around the world, but as far as it's up to us, we should seek to use our power and influence and our leverage to encourage all rulers of the world and everybody in the world to see that all people, no matter what their color of skin, no matter where they're born and raised, no matter what, that they recognize that they have these objective and unalienable rights that ought not be violated by anybody.
So you want the U.S. to be a global bully that goes around threatening anyone, as that would be the result of using our influence, that doesn't agree with your views. It's interesting that now his view has shifted to being just basic human rights. I have no qualm with wanting to achieve basic human rights for all, but I do have a problem with achieving that goal through violence, the threat of violence, or the threat of withholding humanitarian aid, which is going to compound, not help the problem. Tim is as naive as I was at age 20. One would think he would have outgrown that stage by now.
Then, given their libertarian freedom, they can lose, and that's why we have prisons here.
I sure hope he clarifies this. Is he saying that anyone who violates the rights of another should go to prison? Does that include not agreeing that Christianity should have a place of privilege? Would I be sent to prison for such a thought? If so, he's advocating for the very thing that he claims he is not advocating for. It's really hard to tell what he wants at this point.
We respect Americans' freedoms to not choose Christian values. Again, I'm not advocating that everybody has to be a Christian here. I'm advocating that we ought to live according to America's theological and philosophical foundation.
Problem is, America has no theological foundations. The ones that you impose on it cannot be enforced without violating the very Constitution you claim to want to protect. If everyone must live by the values that you claim are the foundation of the country, then you absolutely are claiming to impose Christianity on all, as you claim those values as Christian values. I realize you are trying to say one can have the same values as me and not be a Christian. And while that is true, it's also true that many citizens in this country do not agree with your values. I would go so far as to say that most people don't. Take abortion, for example. Your position on abortion would be to have a national ban, but that position is overwhelmingly rejected even in states that are right-leaning conservative states. If your position is your values are to be imposed on the majority who reject them, because you think your values reflect the founding values of the nation, then you want to do away with the Constitution and a democratic form of government. While claiming you don't want to impose your values on people who don't agree with you, you continually say you want to do just that, not only within this country, but in every other country on the planet, because you claim a God-given right to do so. This is what is so pathetic about your position. You claim to have a reasonable standard, but you can provide no evidence to back your claims about the foundations of your position, and then you want to impose your views on all while simultaneously claiming that's not what you want to do. Tim, do you even have a fucking clue about what you really want?
Believe that Satan exists. Whenever I bring this up, I'm like, well, the Satanists are actually atheists. Okay, I know there's different brands of Satanists. Let's think of the kind of Satanism that actually believes they're worshiping Satan and ought to sacrifice virgins, really sacrifice virgins on the altar.
Theological Satanists.
Theological Satanists. That we say no to that pluralism. Why? Because it violates America's theological and philosophical foundations.
No, absolutely not true. We say no to religious practices that are harmful to other people. Where we draw the line is determined by a test given to us by the Supreme Court. It has nothing to do with American theological foundations. There is no law and no court that judges the theology of a religious group to determine if it meets the theological foundations of the country. The First Amendment absolutely precludes such a thing. That doesn't mean that there are no limits on what one can do in a religious ceremony, but the limits are not theological. For the government to ban a religious practice, it must meet the Lemon test. It must have a non-religious purpose, here protecting the life of the victim. It must not favor any particular set of religious beliefs, and it doesn't. No religious group is allowed to practice human sacrifice, be it Christian, Satanist, Hindu, Muslim. It doesn't matter. The rule applies to all. And third, it must not overly involve the government with religion. If the purpose of banning human sacrifice as a religious practice were in fact because it violated our theological foundation, it would fail the test as it would be the government overly involving itself in religion. Tim is obviously poorly informed about law and government on the issues of religion. Why he considers himself a person who can speak to this issue is beyond me. What's more, his entire religion is based on human sacrifice. If our country was based on the values of his religion, human sacrifice should be perfectly okay.
Hamas, the religion of Hamas. People say, well, that's not actual true Islam. That's debatable. I think David Wood would tell you that it is.
Why should we care what David Wood says? If you haven't seen The Skeptic's latest video on David Wood, give it a view. He is likely a complete fraud. Until I saw that video, I never looked into David Wood's backstory and all of his claims about going to prison for attempted murder of his father, which are backed by nothing but himself as the source. Not a single news story backs his claims.
Let's suppose it's not true Islam and just call it Hamas Islam. Hamas Islam is not the kind of pluralism that works here. What is the kind of pluralism that works here? Any view that makes sense of America's theological and philosophical foundations.
What does that even mean? Makes sense to who? Makes sense in what way? Atheism makes sense in view of American foundations. Is atheism okay?
So you think it's okay?
I don't think anybody should practice anything that violates in action America's theological and philosophical foundations. That's why we have jail and prisons.
This is the primary problem with Tim's position. Jonathan asks him a reasonable question. Should ideology you disagree with, such as Hamas, be banned? I cut out most of the question as it was interrupted by Tim 3 times. When Tim goes to answer the question, he interrupts himself, shifts the topic, or moves to an example of something but never answers the question. Should only certain practices be banned, or should religious ideas Tim disagrees with be banned? The world may never know.
How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop? The world may never know.
Pluralism
what I'm asking is,
works.
I still haven't. You haven't answered my question though.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hold his feet to the fire. Does he want to ban religious ideas or only practices?
What I'm asking is,
Tim
if
didn't know he was getting
somebody
into a debate
believes they
today.
should sacrifice virgins, but never sacrifices virgins, but still says that that's a good thing, even though they don't do it, they're living inconsistent with the religion, all that, right? Is that person allowed to remain in the United States, or is that person outlawed by the state? How?
Well,
what
seems
should
to
be
me,
the case?
you can think whatever you want. Nobody goes to jail for thinking, at least not yet.
That sounds ominous. Does Tim want thought police too?
So
Here's-
no law that bans the person who thinks that. Only laws that, like we have, that says you can't murder virgins.
Now,
right?
now perhaps there should be a law against allowing the Church of Hamas Islam to practice, to even preach that.
So now
Well,
we prohibit speech.
Well, there is some speech that is prohibited now.
Granted, but do you advocate for allowing U.S. law on what is not protected speech? What Jonathan asked you would absolutely be protected speech. For you to suggest that you would ban preaching of some religions because some forms of speech are not protected either shows you to be trying to duck a serious question or shows your lack of understanding of the 5 areas of speech that are unprotected. The 5 being fraud, defamation, incitement to riot, obscenity, child pornography, and fighting words or threats. Preaching a doctrine that you don't like doesn't fit into any of these.
There's nothing against thinking, but if you're teaching, hey, congregation, you ought to go out and kill and rape Jews. I would never do it, but you guys should. No,
Again, Tim fails to answer the question. This falls under one of the current forms of unprotected speech, fighting words, or incitement to riot, depending on how far it goes. But that isn't the question. If a person thinks this, and it's part of their religion, but they don't preach this particular point, is the entire religion banned? Or do you only ban preaching things that are already banned as prohibited speech?
look, I'm saying we ought to, if we're Americans who believe that humans have rights that are objective and unalienable and ought not be violated by anybody, including governments, then we ought to strive to live as consistently as possible.
Okay, but this isn't the Christian nationalist position. This is just a support the status quo position. It has nothing to do with enforcing Christian values, as the idea of humans having inalienable rights is not a Christian idea.
Okay, here's an interesting question that I think kind of gets to the heart of what some in our audience, the atheists, might wonder. Honestly, atheist says, let's get to brass tacks here. As an atheist, how is my liberty protected under a Christian nationalist system? Tim?
Thank you, Braxton. Great question. I'm glad you took that one.
As a Christian who is a nationalist, I affirm that you have rights that ought not be violated by anybody, including governments. And I would give my life to protect your rights.
Then you are not a Christian nationalist. As you said earlier, you are a Christian and you are some sort of a nationalist, but you are not a Christian nationalist. Just like if you were a basket and in you was a ball, it would not necessarily be a basketball, because a ball in a basket is not what a basketball is. And a nationalist who is a Christian is not what a Christian nationalist is. Suggestion, Tim, if you want to go on a show to defend Christian nationalism, first find out what Christian nationalism is.
And I think our government should defend your rights. There you go. Now, I would say that I don't think that as an atheist you can make sense personally right? You cannot make logical sense of America's philosophical foundations.
Back that claim. What is it about America's philosophical foundations that I am unable to make sense of? How would you even claim to know that, not knowing what it is that I can and cannot make sense of?
Where do these rights come from? Are they subjective? Do we just make them up? If so, can they be taken away? I don't think you have unalienable objective rights that ought not be violated. It's just a nice idea that a lot of people agree on.
What difference does that make? Clearly, the rights can be taken away, which is why the colonies broke away in the first place, because the King of England withheld those rights. Clearly, they are not God-given inalienable rights, as if they were, King George would never have been able to take them away from the colonists.
God save King George!
The colonists wanted these rights, so they claimed them for themselves, fought a war, and earned the right to govern themselves and to give themselves these rights. Then they went about doing just that. Where was there a God anywhere in this process? Nowhere. No God gave them these rights. They fought for them and earned them. If these really were God-given and inalienable, then no country would be able to deny such rights to their citizens. Yet they do. If there really is a God out there declaring this to be a human right, either this God is too weak to accomplish his purpose in seeing to it that everyone has these rights, or this God doesn't care. It's only an ideal for this God that this God has no intention of enforcing. Either way, they are not God-given rights. They are human-given rights. There, I made sense of it. So can my viewpoint stand? Yours certainly can't. The idea that a God has given you your constitutional rights doesn't fit the facts of American history, nor the history of any other country for that matter. Maybe it's the Christian view that is unable to make sense of our philosophical foundations. I'm only halfway through this video, but this is long enough for one video. I'll look through the rest, and if there's anything worth addressing, I'll make a part 2. If you don't see a part 2 next week, it means Tim just says a lot more of the same. Live your life.